Your corn is an eyesore, Major. We've improved it. The words hung in the humid morning air, thicker than the swarm of gnats buzzing around my head, each one a tiny, infuriating punctuation mark to a statement of such breathtaking arrogance it almost felt like a physical blow. I stared at the woman standing before me, her floral print moo-moo a garish splash of color against the fresh, brown scar she had carved through my land. Her name was Karen, and her title, which she wore like a crown of thorns she expected everyone else to bleed from, was president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. Behind her, a 50-yard-wide, quarter-mile-long gash of churned earth and pulverized stalks of my heirloom Bloody Butcher corn ran straight through the heart of my field, ending abruptly at the far tree line. The path was littered with the bright green and deep red corpses of a crop I had spent months nurturing. A crop that represented not just a significant financial investment, but a connection to the 4 generations of my family who had worked this very soil. The small yellow bobcat sat silently beside a stack of neatly piled trail markers, a monument to the morning's violation. My fists were clenched so tight my knuckles were white, the grit of my own field grinding under my fingernails, and I could feel a familiar, cold fire starting to burn in my gut. The same fire that had kept me steady through 2 tours in places where arrogance got people killed. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of diesel and crushed vegetation filling my lungs. "You've improved it?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Karen, you just drove a piece of heavy machinery through my private property, destroying thousands of dollars of my crops without my permission, without so much as a phone call. That's not an improvement. That's criminal trespass and destruction of property." She waved a dismissive, bearinged hand, the diamonds catching the sun. "Don't be so dramatic, Major Callahan. It's a walking trail. For the community. The residents have been asking for one, and your unsightly field was the most direct route to the woods. We've increased the value of your property by providing recreational access." I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. "You have no right to my land. There is no easement here. This farm's property lines have been recorded with the county for 150 years. You are the president of an HOA that governs that subdivision," I said, pointing a rigid finger at the sprawling collection of beige McMansions over the hill. "Your authority ends where my property begins. You know this." Her face, already flushed from the heat, darkened to a deep plum. "We are a community, Major. You should try being a part of it instead of hoarding all this land for your hobby." She gestured at my fields, my barn, my home, as if it were all a childish indulgence. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was a force of nature, like a hurricane or a flood. It was the calm, certain belief that her desires superseded my rights, my history, my livelihood. That was the moment I knew this wouldn't be a simple dispute settled with a handshake and an apology. This was a declaration of war. This is my story of how I fought back. If you've ever had your own nightmare with a power-tripping HOA or a neighbor from hell, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your stories because, believe me, you are not alone. Now let me take you back to how this all started, because this attack wasn't random. It was the culmination of a simmering conflict that began the day I came home. I retired from the Army Corps of Engineers as a major after 22 years of service. I'd spent my career designing and overseeing the construction of everything from forward operating bases in Afghanistan to flood control systems on the Mississippi. I understood land, I understood rules, and I understood the chain of command. When my grandfather passed and left me the family farm, it felt like coming full circle. The Callahan farm wasn't some massive agricultural enterprise. It was 160 acres of rolling Carolina land that had been in my family since after the Civil War. It was where I'd spent my summers as a boy, learning to drive a tractor and mend fences. Returning to it wasn't about retiring to a life of leisure. It was about preserving a legacy. My plan was to specialize in high-yield, non-GMO heirloom crops, the kind that chefs in the city would pay a premium for. My first big crop was the Bloody Butcher corn, a variety known for its deep red kernels and rich, nutty flavor, perfect for gourmet grits and cornmeal. It was a challenging crop, requiring specific care, but the potential payoff was huge. I'd already secured contracts with 3 high-end restaurants in Charlotte. The problem was the new development, Whispering Pines Estates, that had sprung up on the adjacent parcel of land 5 years prior. It was a sea of cookie-cutter houses with perfectly manicured lawns, governed by a thick book of covenants and restrictions. From the moment I moved back and started working the farm in earnest, I was a problem for them. My tractor was too loud. My barn, a beautiful historic structure I just had restored, was the wrong shade of red. The dust from planting season was a nuisance. The complaints always came in the form of crisply printed letters on HOA letterhead, signed by Karen Miller, president. She was a woman who had moved down from somewhere up north, buying the biggest house on the highest point of the development, and had immediately taken over the HOA with the zeal of a conquering general. She saw my farm not as a piece of local history, but as a blemish on her perfect, sanitized world. I'd met her once before the trail incident, at a town hall meeting about zoning. She had argued passionately against allowing a local brewery to open, citing concerns about the element it would attract. I had argued for it, speaking about the need for local businesses and community gathering places. She had looked at me then with a mixture of pity and contempt, as if I were a hopelessly naive rustic who simply didn't understand the finer points of curated living. I had tried to be a good neighbor. I adjusted my tilling schedule to avoid early weekend mornings. I planted a line of fast-growing leyland cypress trees along the property line to act as a dust and sound barrier, an expensive gesture of goodwill. It didn't matter. To Karen, my very existence was a violation. The farm was real, it was messy, it was authentic, and it stood in stark opposition to the artificial perfection she was trying to manufacture. The walking trail was her ultimate power play, a way to literally trample my rights and impose her will. Standing there in the ruins of my corn, I realized she hadn't just destroyed a crop. She had taken my gesture of goodwill, the clear line I had established between our worlds, and bulldozed right over it. She thought she was dealing with a simple old farmer. She was about to find out she was dealing with a man who had spent his entire adult life meticulously planning, documenting, and executing complex operations against determined adversaries. The war had begun, and I was on my home turf. The first 24 hours after discovering the destruction were a blur of controlled, methodical rage. Karen, after delivering her pronouncement about improving my property, had turned on her heel and marched back toward her beige kingdom, leaving me standing in the wreckage. My first instinct, the primal one screaming in the back of my skull, was to hop on my John Deere and improve her perfectly manicured front lawn in a similar fashion. But the soldier in me, the officer, took over. Emotion is a liability in a conflict. Data is ammunition. I pulled out my phone, my hand surprisingly steady, and began the documentation. I started with a wide video pan, slowly sweeping across the entire length of the damage, narrating in a calm, even voice the date, the time, and what I was looking at. I walked the entire quarter-mile length of the gouge, my boots sinking into the soft, churned soil. I filmed the crushed stalks, the uprooted plants, the deep tire treads left by the bobcat. I zoomed in on the neatly stacked pile of trail markers, each one branded with the Whispering Pines Estates logo. I filmed the bobcat itself, getting a clear shot of the rental company's sticker and phone number on the side. I then switched to photos, taking hundreds of them from every conceivable angle, creating a comprehensive, undeniable record of the scene. Every photo was geotagged and time-stamped. This was second nature to me. It was the same process as documenting a breach in a levee or an unauthorized construction on a military base. You don't just say it happened, you prove it, beyond any shadow of a doubt. My next call was to the county sheriff. A deputy, a young guy named Miller who looked like he was barely out of high school, arrived about an hour later. He walked the path with me, his expression a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment. "She really just did this?" he asked, kicking at a clump of ruined corn. I showed him the video on my phone. He sighed, shaking his head. "Well, I can certainly write up a report for trespassing and destruction of property. You'll want to get an official estimate of the damages for sure." He took my statement, Karen's name, and the address of the HOA. He was polite, professional, but I could tell this was likely to end up as a civil matter, a messy dispute the sheriff's office had little appetite for. I knew I couldn't rely on them to be my cavalry. I had to build my own case, brick by painful brick. After the deputy left, I called Frank. Frank Connolly had been my platoon sergeant in the Corps of Engineers and was now a licensed land surveyor. He owed me a favor after I'd helped his son get an internship with a big construction firm. "Jack, my boy, what's the emergency?" His booming voice came over the phone. I explained the situation, my voice tight with a cold fury I wasn't letting myself fully feel yet. "The nerve," he muttered. "I'll be there at 0600 tomorrow. I'll bring the total station. We'll map every square inch of that damage and officially certify the property lines. She won't be able to wiggle out of it by claiming she was confused about the boundary." My final call of the day was to Dr. Eris Thorne at the State University's Agricultural Extension. Dr. Thorne was the foremost expert on heirloom grains in the state. I explained what had happened to my bloody butcher crop. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Major Callahan," he said finally, his voice grave, "this is more than just lost corn. You had one of the few pure strains of pre-hybridized bloody butcher in this region. The genetic purity of that seed stock is what makes it valuable. How much of the field was destroyed?" I did a quick, painful calculation in my head. About 3 acres, right through the middle. I could almost hear him wince. 3 acres. "Major, the loss isn't just the market value of the corn you would have harvested this year. It's the loss of future seed stock. It's the contamination of the remaining crop from stress and exposure. We need to quantify not just the yield loss, but the damage to the genetic integrity of your entire operation." He agreed to come out in 2 days to take soil samples, plant tissue samples, and conduct a full agronomic assessment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the violation, I sat on my porch, a legal pad on my lap. I created a file just like I would for a major project. It was labeled Operation Enduring Justice. Inside, I started a timeline, a list of contacts, and a running tally of expenses. The rental cost of the Bobcat, the deputy's report number, Frank's upcoming survey fee, Dr. Thorne's consultation fee. This wasn't just about getting reimbursed for some corn. This was about establishing a pattern of deliberate, malicious action. The next morning, I sent a formal, registered letter to Karen, CCing the entire HOA board. It was simple, direct, and devoid of emotion. It stated the facts. On this date, an unauthorized trail was cut through my property, destroying a significant portion of my crop. It cited the statutes for criminal trespass and property destruction. It informed her that I was having the damages professionally assessed and would be seeking full restitution. I demanded the immediate removal of their equipment and trail markers and a written assurance that no further incursions would occur. I didn't threaten to sue. I didn't yell. I simply stated the facts and outlined the consequences, creating a paper trail that showed I had attempted to resolve this professionally. I knew she would interpret it as weakness. I was counting on it. Her overconfidence would be the rope she'd use to hang herself. I just had to be patient enough to hand it to her, one carefully documented inch at a time. The war had moved from the field to the paperwork, and that was a battlefield where I was just as comfortable and far more disciplined than she could ever imagine. Just as I predicted, Karen's response wasn't an apology, it was an escalation. 2 days after my registered letter was delivered, a letter I received no direct reply to, the first counter salvo arrived in my mailbox. It was a thick envelope made of expensive, cream-colored paper, bearing the embossed logo of the Whispering Pines Estates HOA. Inside wasn't a settlement offer, but a barrage of official violation notices. The sheer audacity was stunning. The first notice was a $50 fine for improperly maintained property. The description read, "A large, unsightly swath of bare dirt and dead vegetation is visible from the community walking trail, negatively impacting the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." She was fining me for the damage she had caused. The bitter, ironic laugh that escaped my lips was a sound I hadn't made in years. It was the laugh of a man witnessing absurdity so profound it looped back around to being almost beautiful in its perfection. But there was more. A second notice, for $100, was for unapproved structures. The structure in question? My historic, beautifully restored barn. The violation? The color barn red is not on the approved palette of earth tones for structures visible from the Whispering Pines common areas. A color palette was attached, a collection of beiges, taupes, and muted greens that looked like they'd been selected by a committee of people who found vanilla too spicy. The third notice was the masterpiece, a $200 fine for nuisance activity. The description cited my John Deere 4020 tractor, a vintage machine I'd lovingly restored. It was parked neatly beside my barn, a good 200 yards from the nearest HOA property line. The violation stated, the storage of agricultural or commercial machinery in a location visible to residents is prohibited. It was a declaration that my very act of farming was a nuisance she intended to regulate out of existence. I spread the 3 violation notices out on my kitchen table like enemy battle plans. This was classic bully tactics. When confronted with your own wrongdoing, attack with overwhelming, nonsensical force to put your victim on the defensive. She wasn't just trying to intimidate me, she was trying to bury me in paperwork, to exhaust me, to make the cost of fighting her so high that I would simply give up and accept her improvement. It was then that my neighbor, Arthur Pendleton, knocked on my door. Arthur was a retired corporate lawyer who had been one of the first buyers in Whispering Pines. He was a quiet, bird-watching widower in his late 70s who had, in a moment of weakness, bought into the dream of a peaceful, maintenance-free retirement. He now spent most of his days regretting it. I'd spoken with him a few times over the fence line, mostly about the migratory patterns of warblers. He held a plate of cookies in one hand and had a worried look on his face. "Saw the sheriff's car the other day, Jack," he said, stepping inside. "Then I heard the gossip at the mail kiosk. I wanted to see if you were all right." I gestured to the notices on the table. "I'm fine, Arthur, but it seems your president has declared war." He peered at the papers through his bifocals, his eyebrows climbing higher with each one. He read the fine for the unsightly swath of bare dirt and let out a low whistle. "Good heavens, she's fining you for the mess she made? That's chutzpah on a level I haven't seen since I was deposing asbestos executives." He looked up at me, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Jack, this is a coordinated harassment campaign. She's using the HOA covenants as a weapon, and she's banking on the fact that you'll be too intimidated or too busy to fight it properly." I nodded, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "What she doesn't know is that I've spent half my life dealing with by-the-book martinets who think rules are a one-way street. What's the play here, Arthur, from a legal standpoint?" He leaned against the counter, his demeanor shifting from concerned neighbor to seasoned attorney. "First, you respond to every single one of these, in writing, certified mail. You don't just deny the violation, you dismantle it. For the improperly maintained property, you state that the condition was caused by the HOA's own documented act of trespass and that their attempt to fine you for it is a bad faith action. For the barn, you check the original master plat and the county zoning. I'd be willing to bet my pension your farm is exempt from their architectural covenants, as it predates the HOA by a century. For the tractor, you cite your right to conduct lawful agricultural activities on land zoned for that purpose." He paused, tapping a finger on the table. "This is her mistake, Jack. By doing this, she's creating a documented pattern of harassment. This isn't just about the trail anymore. It's about her using her position to maliciously target a non-member landowner. That moves this out of a simple dispute and into something far more serious. It's called tortious interference." I felt that cold fire in my gut again, but this time it was tempered with the ice of a clear strategy. So I document, I respond, and I wait for her to overplay her hand even more. Arthur smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "Precisely. She thinks she's building a case against you. What she's actually doing is building your case against her." That afternoon, I sat down at my computer and began to type. For each violation, I crafted a formal, multi-page response. I cited county ordinances, state laws on agricultural protection, and the legal principle of unclean hands. The idea that a party cannot seek equitable relief if they themselves have acted improperly. I attached copies of Frank's brand new survey, which clearly showed the trail was hundreds of feet inside my property. I attached a preliminary damage estimate from Dr. Thorne, which was already climbing into the tens of thousands of dollars. I sent each response in its own certified envelope, addressed not only to Karen, but to each individual member of the HOA board. I wanted every one of them to know exactly what was happening, to have the facts placed directly in their hands. They could no longer claim ignorance. They were now officially on notice. The paper war had begun, and I had just launched a precision-guided missile of pure, unassailable fact right into the heart of their beige empire. The next phase of the operation was about transitioning from defense to offense. Arthur's advice had been invaluable. My meticulous, fact-based responses to the violation notices seemed to have momentarily stunned the beast. The flow of threatening letters stopped, but an unnerving silence took its place. I knew Karen wasn't retreating. She was regrouping, likely consulting the HOA's overpriced lawyers to find a new angle of attack. This quiet period was my window of opportunity. Arthur and I met on my porch, a thick file labeled Operation Enduring Justice on the table between us, along with 2 glasses of iced tea. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and distant thunder. "She's gone quiet," I said, "and that worries me more than the letters." Arthur took a slow sip of his tea. "It should. It means she's realized you're not an easy target and is now spending HOA money to find a way to make this legal battle so expensive, you'll have to fold. They'll try to drown you in motions, discovery requests, depositions. It's the standard playbook for a well-funded entity against an individual." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Which is why we don't play their game. We don't just sue for simple trespass. That's what she expects. A lawsuit for a few thousand in damages, which the HOA's insurance would cover, and she'd walk away without a scratch, claiming she was just acting in the community's best interest." He tapped the file. "We need to hit her where she's personally vulnerable. We need to make this about her actions, not the HOA's as an entity." I listened, absorbing every word. This was strategy, my native language. "How do we do that?" I asked. "We don't file a standard lawsuit in civil court," Arthur explained, a glint in his eye. "We file a formal agricultural damage claim under State Statute 7B21. It's a lesser-known law, part of the Right to Farm Act, designed to protect farmers from exactly this kind of thing: negligent or willful damage to crops and livestock. It's administered through the Department of Agriculture's legal division, not the regular court system, at least initially. This was new territory for me. "What's the advantage?" "Several," Arthur said, ticking them off on his fingers. "First, the burden of proof is different and often more favorable to the farmer. Second, the investigators and mediators are experts in agriculture, not just general law. They understand the value of seed stock and soil contamination. They won't just see a few ruined corn stalks. And third, and this is the beautiful part, Jack, the statute includes a provision for treble damages if the act is found to be willful and malicious. And even more importantly, it has language that allows for piercing the corporate veil of an organization like an HOA if an officer is found to have acted with gross negligence or outside the scope of their authority. It means the judgment could be levied against her personally." The implications of that settled in. Treble damages, personal liability. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was a financial kill shot. The total estimated damage, according to Dr. Thorne's comprehensive report, which now included costs for soil remediation, loss of the current crop, loss of 2 future years of seed stock propagation, and the contractual penalties I'd have to pay to the restaurants, was hovering around $75,000. Treble damages would push that to $225,000. No insurance policy would cover a willful, illegal act. That amount would come out of Karen's own pocket. "She directed the contractor to cut the trail," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "She admitted it to my face. She acted without a board vote, which I'm willing to bet is outside the scope of her authority under the HOA bylaws." "Exactly," Arthur exclaimed, slapping the table. "We argue that this wasn't an official act of the HOA. This was Karen Miller's personal vanity project, which she executed using HOA resources under false pretenses. We make her the sole target." For the next week, Arthur and I worked like a 2-man command staff. We drafted the claim, a document that grew to over 50 pages. It was a masterpiece of cold, hard evidence. We included Frank's certified survey maps with the property lines highlighted in blazing red. We included Dr. Thorne's 20-page agronomic assessment, complete with photos, soil analysis charts, and a detailed financial breakdown that was footnoted like a doctoral thesis. We included my sworn affidavit detailing my conversation with Karen. We included copies of the harassing violation notices and my formal responses, establishing the pattern of bad faith actions. When it was finished, the document was less a complaint and more an indictment. Arthur had a process server he'd used for years, a wiry, formidable man named Carl, who took immense pride in his work. We gave him 2 copies. One was for the HOA's registered agent, the other was for Karen Miller, to be served personally at her home address. "Make sure you hand it directly to her," Arthur instructed Carl. "I want to be able to state in court that she personally received it." 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Carl. "Service affected," he said in his gravelly voice. "The HOA's lawyer took their copy without a fuss. But the other one, that was special." "What happened?" I asked. "I rang the bell at her big house on the hill. She answered, looked me up and down like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. I said her name. Karen Miller? She confirms. I hand her the papers and say, 'You've been served.' She looks at the cover sheet, sees her name, Karen Miller, in her personal and individual capacity, and all the color just drains out of her face. She looked at me and said, 'This must be a mistake. This is an HOA matter.' I just smiled and said, 'Ma'am, according to page 1, paragraph 3, this is a you matter.' Then I walked away. I think she was still standing there, frozen, when I drove off. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a small, grim smile. The missile had hit its target. The initial shock and awe campaign was over. Now came the long, grinding siege. Karen had wanted a war of attrition, hoping to bleed me dry. She was about to find out that I had just turned the tables and targeted her personal supply lines. The silence that followed the serving of the agricultural claim was different. It wasn't the quiet of a predator regrouping. It was the stunned silence of a bully who had just been punched squarely in the mouth, hard. The legal machinery was now in motion, but I knew that a legal victory alone wasn't enough. Karen's power didn't just come from the HOA's bylaws. It came from the apathy and intimidation of the residents of Whispering Pines. To truly win, I needed to dismantle her power base. I needed allies from within her own kingdom. My first visit was to Sarah Jenkins, a young mother I'd seen pushing a stroller along the road that bordered my farm. A few weeks prior, I'd seen her frantically scrubbing at her driveway with a bucket and brush, her 2 small children watching from the porch. I had stopped my truck to ask if she needed a hand. She'd looked up, her face streaked with tears of frustration. "It's the HOA," she'd said, her voice trembling with anger. "My kids drew a hopscotch board with sidewalk chalk. We got a $75 fine for unapproved property alteration and a notice that if it wasn't removed in 24 hours, they'd send a pressure washing company and bill us $300. I remembered the sheer injustice of it. Now, armed with a new purpose, I knocked on her door. She answered, looking wary. I introduced myself properly. "I'm Jack Callahan, your neighbor with the farm. I'm the one the HOA is in a dispute with over that new trail." Recognition and then sympathy dawned on her face. "Oh my gosh, I heard about that. It's awful what she did." I handed her a simple 1-page summary of my situation, the destruction of the crop, the fraudulent fines, and the fact that I was holding Karen personally liable. "I'm talking to neighbors," I said simply. "I think Karen's gone too far, and I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way. Your story about the sidewalk chalk stuck with me." She invited me in. Her living room was filled with toys, a chaotic, happy mess that stood in stark contrast to the sterile perfection Karen demanded. Sarah told me her story and the stories of others. The family who was forced to tear out a beautiful, mature Japanese maple because it wasn't on the approved tree list. The retired couple who received weekly fines because their dachshund, a tiny ancient creature named Peanut, occasionally barked when the mailman came. The man who was ordered to repaint his front door because the sun had faded it half a shade from the officially sanctioned Chesapeake taupe. It was a litany of petty tyrannies, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. "Everyone's afraid of her," Sarah said, her voice low. "She has a little group of supporters, the ones who attend all the meetings and vote for whatever she wants. They love the power. The rest of us, we just want to live our lives. We pay our dues and try to stay off her radar. It's easier to just pay the fine and repaint the door than to fight her. That's what she's counting on, I said. But what if you didn't have to fight her alone? What if a dozen of you stood up at the next meeting? What if you all formally challenged these ridiculous fines at the same time? I left her with a copy of my file summary and my phone number. Think about it, I said. There's strength in numbers. My next stop was to see a man named David Chen. He was a tech guy who worked from home, and I knew from Arthur that he had been in a protracted battle with Karen over the solar panels he wanted to install on his roof. I found him in his garage tinkering with a 3D printer. I gave him the same brief. He listened intently, his expression hardening as I explained the personal liability angle. She told me my solar panels would detract from the neighborhood's cohesive design aesthetic, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. This from a woman who drives a fuchsia-colored convertible. I showed her the state law that explicitly prohibits HOAs from banning solar installations. She found a loophole in the bylaws about roof-mounted equipment and has held up my application in the Architectural Review Committee for 6 months. He took the paper from me and read it. You're actually going after her personal assets, not just the HOA? The damage was her decision, I affirmed. Her willful act outside the scope of a proper vote. My lawyer believes she's personally exposed. A slow, dangerous smile spread across David's face. I'm a data analyst, 20, he said. I've been scraping the HOA's monthly financial statements from the community web portal for the past 2 years. They're supposed to be transparent, but they're not. The spending categories are incredibly vague. Common area maintenance, landscaping, administrative expenses, tens of thousands of dollars with no itemized receipts. My heart beat a little faster. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if she was willing to use HOA funds without proper authorization to bulldoze your field, it's probably not the first time she's played fast and loose with the budget. If someone, say a lawyer like your friend Arthur, were to file a discovery motion for itemized receipts and contractor invoices, we might find some very interesting things. This was it. This was the community alliance taking shape. It wasn't just about my field anymore. It was about a pattern of abuse that affected everyone. Sarah had the stories, the human cost. David had the data, the financial breadcrumbs. Arthur had the legal expertise, and I had the initial grievance, the spark that could ignite the whole thing. Over the next week, a small, clandestine resistance began to form. We met at my farmhouse, away from the prying eyes of Karen's loyalists. There was Sarah, David, Arthur, and 2 other couples who had been burned by Karen's reign. We spread David's spreadsheets and my legal documents across my large dining room table. It felt like a war room. We were no longer just a collection of aggrieved individuals. We were a unified front. We planned our strategy for the next official HOA meeting, which was in 3 weeks. We wouldn't just complain. We would come armed with facts, figures, and a coordinated plan to demand accountability. The tide was turning. Karen thought she was in a legal battle with one stubborn farmer. She had no idea she was about to face a full-blown insurrection from within her own ranks. The discovery process in a lawsuit is where the real battles are often won or lost, long before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. It's the methodical, often tedious process of forcing the other side to turn over documents, answer questions under oath, and reveal the evidence they'd rather keep hidden. For this, Arthur was a maestro, and Karen had just handed him a full orchestra of potential misconduct. Our first move was a precisely worded request for production of documents sent to the HOA's legal counsel. We didn't just ask for general information. We asked for specifics with a surgical precision designed to leave no wiggle room. We requested all communications, emails, text messages, meeting minutes, related to the planning of any community trail for the past 2 years. We demanded all invoices, work orders, and payment records to any and all landscaping or construction contractors during the same period. We asked for the minutes of the board meeting where the trail project and its budget were supposedly approved. And, leveraging David Chen's data, we requested itemized receipts for every expenditure over $500 that had been categorized under the vague headings of landscaping or common area maintenance. The HOA's lawyers responded with the usual stonewalling, claiming the requests were overly broad, burdensome, and not relevant to the matter at hand. Arthur shot back a motion to compel, arguing that Karen's entire defense rested on the claim that she was acting in her official capacity, and therefore we had the right to examine the evidence of that official action, or the lack thereof. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, agreed with us. She gave the HOA 14 days to produce the documents. When the boxes of files arrived at Arthur's office, it was like Christmas morning for a forensic accountant. David Chen, Arthur, and I spent a weekend huddled in Arthur's study, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose, sifting through a mountain of paper. For hours, it was a frustrating search. The financial records were a mess of incompetence and obfuscation. But then David found it. "Bingo," he whispered, holding up an invoice from a company called Lush Green Landscaping. The invoice was for $9,500. The line item description was annual common area mulching and shrubbery replacement. The date was 3 days before Karen bulldozed my field. "There's no way they did that much mulching in the middle of summer," David said. "It doesn't make sense." Arthur picked up the phone and called the number on the invoice. He put it on speaker. A man answered, "Lush Green." Arthur adopted his folksy, disarming persona. "Hi there, my name is Arthur. I'm with the Whispering Pines HOA, just doing a little audit of our records. I'm looking at your invoice from a couple of months back for $9,500. Can you tell me what that was for?" "The description just says, mulching." There was a hesitant pause on the other end. Yeah, the president, Karen? She told me how to bill that. It wasn't really for mulching. It was for, some path clearing with a bobcat." My eyes met Arthur's across the table. This was the smoking gun. "A path clearing?" Arthur asked innocently. "Was that on the HOA common grounds?" Another pause. "Well, she gave me a map she'd drawn, told me exactly where to go. Said it was all cleared, an old easement or something." "Would you happen to have a copy of that map?" Arthur asked, his voice smooth as silk. "And any other written instructions she gave you?" "Sure," the landscaper said. "She texted me the instructions and a picture of the drawing. Just to be sure." A few hours later, a fax machine in Arthur's office whirred to life. It printed out a series of documents that made my blood run cold, then hot with righteous fury. First was a copy of the landscaper's invoice. Second was a printout of a text message chain between him and Karen. The landscaper had texted, "Are you sure about this line? My GPS says it's on the neighboring property." Karen's reply was instantaneous and damning. "I am the HOA president. You will follow the path I have laid out. The farmer is a problem and we are solving it. Just get it done and bill it under the maintenance account." The final page was a fax of the hand-drawn map. It was a crude sketch of my field, with a dotted line running right through the middle and an arrow pointing to it with the words, "New trail here." This was it. This was everything. It was premeditated. It was malicious. It was documented. She had lied to the contractor. She had instructed him to break the law. And she had deliberately used HOA funds under a false invoice to cover it up. This transcended gross negligence. This was fraud. The next step was the depositions. Our prime target was the landscaper, Mr. Henderson. We subpoenaed him. Faced with testifying under oath, and with the evidence of the text messages in front of him, he told the truth. He sat in a conference room, sweating under the lights, and recounted how Karen had pressured him, assured him everything was legal, and explicitly told him how to hide the cost in his billing. He was a small business owner, and the HOA was a big contract for him. He was afraid to say no. His testimony was devastating. But the main event was Karen's own deposition. She arrived with 2 lawyers from a high-priced Charlotte firm, looking confident and imperious in a navy blue power suit. Arthur conducted the questioning. He started gently, letting her build her narrative. She described herself as a dedicated community leader, working tirelessly to improve Whispering Pines. She portrayed me as an uncooperative, hostile neighbor. She claimed the board had given her verbal authority to explore options for a nature trail. "And did you explore those options, Mrs. Miller?" Arthur asked calmly. "Yes, I did. I determined the most logical and scenic route," she said with a proud tilt of her chin. Arthur slid a document across the polished table. It was the certified survey map. "Is this the route you chose?" Karen glanced at it. "Yes, it is." "And you were aware that this route was on Major Callahan's private property?" Her lawyer tried to object, but Arthur was ready. It's a direct question about her state of mind, Your Honor. The objection was overruled. Karen's confidence wavered for the first time. I was under the impression there was an old easement. Who gave you that impression? Arthur pressed. Did you consult the county records? Did you commission a survey? It was common knowledge, she stammered. Arthur then slid the text messages across the table. Mrs. Miller, could you please read your reply to Mr. Henderson, dated August 14th, into the record? The color drained from her face as she read her own words. The air in the room became thick and heavy. Her lawyers were frantically whispering to her. She looked up, her eyes flashing with panic and rage. He was supposed to be a professional. I trusted his judgment. So now you're saying it was the landscaper's fault? Arthur asked, his voice like ice. Even though he explicitly questioned the property line and you, in your own words, ordered him to proceed because the farmer, Major Callahan, was a problem you were solving? There was no answer. There was nothing she could say. We had her. The lie, the malice, the cover-up. It was all there, in black and white, and now in a sworn deposition. The siege was over. We had breached the fortress walls and captured the queen. With Karen's deposition locked in and the evidence of her fraud and malice undeniable, the legal case was all but won. The Department of Agriculture's hearing was scheduled, but it felt like a formality. Arthur was confident we would not only win the full damage claim, but that the treble damages and personal liability findings were a certainty. But a quiet legal victory wasn't enough. Karen Miller's power was built on a carefully constructed image of authority and control within her community. To truly achieve justice, that image needed to be publicly dismantled. We needed to show the residents of Whispering Pines not just that she had wronged me, but that she had betrayed them. She had lied to them, misused their money, and exposed their community to massive legal and financial liability, all to settle a personal grudge. We need to control the narrative, I told our little group, gathered once again around my dining table. Right now, the story is just gossip and rumors around the mail kiosk. We need to replace that with cold, hard facts, and we need to do it before her lawyers can spin it. David Chen, ever the data guy, nodded in agreement. We need to go on the offensive, a public information campaign. We decided on a two-pronged attack. First, the local media. Second, a direct confrontation at the next HOA meeting. For the media, we didn't just leak the story. We prepared a professional press kit. It contained a concise two-page summary of the events, carefully vetted by Arthur to be factually accurate and legally sound. It included a copy of the survey, the damning text messages, and the key excerpts from Karen's and the landscaper's depositions. We also included a high-resolution photo of the quarter-mile scar through my cornfield, and a photo of me standing in front of my historic barn, looking not like a victim, but like a resolute landowner defending his rights. I was hesitant about putting my face out there, but Arthur insisted. You're a retired Army major, a veteran. You're a fourth-generation farmer. You're the perfect protagonist for this story. David versus Goliath with a patriotic angle. A local news station will eat this up. He was right. We sent the kit to the top investigative reporter at the biggest news channel in Charlotte. Within 24 hours, my phone was ringing. The reporter, a sharp woman named Maria Flores, wanted an on-camera interview. We agreed, on the condition that they film it on my property. I wanted the viewers to see the land, to see the barn Karen tried to have declared a violation, to see the wound she had carved into the earth. The day of the interview, I didn't dress up. I wore my usual work jeans, a clean flannel shirt, and my worn leather boots. Maria and her cameraman arrived, and I walked them through everything, just as I had for the sheriff. I showed them the property line, marked clearly by Frank's new survey stakes. I stood in the middle of the dead zone, the camera panning across the destruction. When Maria interviewed me, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resort to name-calling. I simply laid out the facts, calmly and methodically, letting the evidence speak for itself. This was never about a walking trail, I said, looking directly into the camera. This was about a person in a position of power who believes the rules don't apply to her. She destroyed my livelihood to satisfy her ego, and she used her neighbor's money to do it. All I'm asking for is accountability. The story aired on the 6 o'clock news that evening. It was the lead segment. They juxtaposed the image of my ravaged field with shots of Karen's immaculate, oversized house. They showed the text messages on screen, blown up for all to see. They played a clip of me, calm and resolute, and then cut to a shot of Karen, taken from a distance, scurrying from her car to her front door, shielding her face from the camera, and shouting, "No comment!" The effect was instantaneous and electric. My phone started ringing with calls from neighbors I'd never even met, offering support. Sarah Jenkins called, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Everyone is watching it, Jack. The neighborhood text threads are exploding. People are furious." The story went viral locally. It was shared thousands of times on social media. The narrative was set: a power-drunk HOA president bullying a local veteran and farmer. Karen was no longer an untouchable queen in her castle. She was a public villain. But we weren't done. The second prong of our attack was the HOA meeting, scheduled for the following week. It was supposed to be a sleepy affair, focused on approving the budget for holiday decorations. Karen, reeling from the news story, likely hoped it would be a quiet evening where she could try to regain control. She had no idea we were planning an ambush. Arthur had scoured the HOA bylaws. During the new business, or open comment portion of the meeting, any homeowner had the right to address the board for 3 minutes. There was no rule stating they couldn't yield their time to another person. Our little alliance had grown. We now had 12 homeowners on our side, including Sarah, David, and the man with the solar panels. That gave us a total of 36 minutes. We synchronized our watches. As the meeting began in the sterile community clubhouse, Karen, looking pale and strained, tried to rush through the agenda. But when she called for new business, Sarah Jenkins stood up first. "I have a point of order," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and I yield my 3 minutes to Major Jack Callahan." A murmur went through the crowd of about 50 residents. Karen's face went white. "He's not a member. He can't speak," she sputtered. Arthur stood up from the back. "Madam President, the bylaws state a member may address the board. They do not prohibit a member from yielding their time to a guest to speak on their behalf. If you'd like to challenge my interpretation, I suggest we call the HOA's attorney, though I suspect he would advise you against it, given the current circumstances." Checkmate. Karen, trapped by the very rules she used to terrorize others, sank back into her chair, defeated. I walked to the podium at the front of the room, carrying a projector and a laptop. David Chen dimmed the lights. The first image I projected onto the wall behind the board members was the text message: "The farmer is a problem, and we are solving it." The room fell silent. For the next 36 minutes, member by member yielded their time to me, and I laid out the entire case, not as a legal argument, but as a story of betrayal. I showed them the map. I showed them the fraudulent invoice. I showed them the fines for the sidewalk chalk and the wrong shade of red. I connected Karen's personal vendetta against me to her pattern of petty tyranny against them all. "She didn't just trespass on my land," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "She trespassed on your trust. She took your money, your dues that you pay to maintain your property values, and used it to wage a personal war and then lied to cover it up." When I finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. Karen sat there speechless as her carefully constructed world crumbled around her in a cacophony of her neighbor's anger. The public exposure was complete. It was no longer my fight, it was theirs. The HOA meeting had been a detonation, and the fallout was swift and spectacular. The carefully maintained facade of Whispering Pines had been shattered, revealing the rot of corruption and abuse underneath. The residents, now armed with the undeniable truth, were no longer apathetic or intimidated. They were a furious, unified force, and their target was singular: Karen Miller. In the chaotic aftermath of the meeting, Arthur, David, and Sarah immediately began channeling the outrage into productive action. Arthur, with his legal acumen, drafted a formal petition citing specific articles in the HOA bylaws that allowed for the removal of a board member for gross misconduct and misuse of funds. The petition called for an immediate special meeting for the sole purpose of holding a vote of no confidence in Karen as president. David Chen set up a simple website with all the evidence we had presented, the depositions, the invoices, the text messages, so every homeowner could review it for themselves. Sarah Jenkins, using the neighborhood text threads and social media groups that had once been platforms for mundane chatter, became a tireless organizer, ensuring every resident knew about the petition in the upcoming vote. The petition needed signatures from 25% of the homeowners to compel a special meeting. They got them in less than 48 hours. The special meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, Karen became a ghost in her own neighborhood. Her fuchsia convertible remained in its garage. Packages were left on her doorstep untouched. She was seen only in fleeting glimpses, a prisoner in the oversized house that had once been her throne. Her small clique of supporters, the ones who had enabled her reign, either fell silent or began to publicly distance themselves, claiming they had been misled. They were rats deserting a sinking ship. Meanwhile, the legal process continued its inexorable march. The day before the special HOA meeting, we received two crucial documents. The first was from the State Department of Agriculture. It was their official ruling on my claim. As Arthur had predicted, it was a total victory. The ruling found that Karen Miller had acted willfully, maliciously, and with gross negligence. It validated our entire damage assessment of $75,000. And crucially, it invoked the treble damages clause, bringing the total judgment to a staggering $225,000. The ruling's final paragraph was the kill shot. It stated that because Karen Miller had acted ultra vires, beyond the scope of her authority, and engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation to conceal her actions, the liability was not the responsibility of the Whispering Pines HOA as an entity. The judgment was against Karen Miller in her personal and individual capacity. The second document arrived that afternoon via courier. It was a letter from the HOA's insurance carrier. In cold legalistic language, it informed the HOA board that after a review of my claim and the associated evidence, which we had happily provided them, they were officially denying coverage for any legal fees or judgments related to the incident. The policy, they explained, covered negligence, not intentional criminal acts or fraud committed by a board member. The letter explicitly mentioned Karen's deposition and the text messages as proof of intent. This was the final nail in her coffin. The HOA would not protect her. The insurance would not protect her. She was alone, exposed, and personally on the hook for $250,000. The night of the special meeting, the community clubhouse was packed to overflowing. People stood along the walls and spilled out the open doors. The atmosphere was electric with tension and a sense of impending justice. The remaining board members, their faces grim, sat at the front table. Karen's chair was empty. The acting president, a nervous accountant named Tom, called the meeting to order. He announced that Karen had submitted her resignation that afternoon. A wave of triumphant murmurs swept through the room, but it was quickly silenced. This wasn't just about her resignation. This was about a public reckoning. Arthur stood and made a motion. I move that the homeowners of Whispering Pines formally accept the resignation of Karen Miller, and further that we vote to formally censure her for gross misconduct, fraud, and misuse of community funds, and that this censure be entered into the permanent public record of this association. A chorus of "second" rang out. The vote was a mere formality. It was nearly unanimous. It was a public branding, a permanent stain on the legacy she had tried to build. Then David Chen stood up. I move that this association formally issue a public apology to our neighbor, Major Jack Callahan, for the damage and harassment he has endured. And I further move that the new board be directed to work with Major Callahan to fund the complete restoration of his damaged property as a gesture of goodwill. Again, the vote was a swift, overwhelming aye. I sat in the back of the room, watching it all unfold, feeling not a sense of gloating triumph, but a quiet, profound satisfaction. This was what accountability looked like. This was the system, so often used by the powerful to crush the powerless, being turned back on itself to deliver justice. A few days later, a for sale sign appeared on Karen Miller's perfectly manicured lawn, the kind of oversized, ostentatious sign used for luxury properties. The judgment against her was a public record, a lien against her assets. The only way for her to pay the $225,000 she owed me was to sell her castle. The symbol of her power and prestige was now nothing more than an asset to be liquidated to pay for her sins. The war was over. The tyrant had been deposed, her personal fortune shattered by the very arrogance that had fueled her rise. The final act of this drama was not one of vengeance, but of restoration. With Karen gone and a new, chastened HOA board in place, the entire atmosphere of the community changed. The oppressive cloud of petty rules and constant surveillance lifted. People started talking to each other again, not in whispered complaints, but as neighbors. Kids' laughter and the scrape of sidewalk chalk returned to the driveways. The new HOA president was Tom, the accountant who had presided over Karen's removal. He was a quiet, reasonable man who, along with the other new board members, seemed genuinely committed to undoing the damage of the previous regime. A week after the special meeting, Tom and two other board members, including David Chen, asked to meet with me. We didn't meet in a clubhouse or an office. They came to my farm. We sat on my porch, the same place where Arthur and I had first plotted our strategy. Tom slid a cashier's check for $25,000 across the table. "This is from the HOA," he said, his voice sincere. "We know the judgment is Karen's personal responsibility, but we, the community, feel a moral obligation to help make this right. This is to cover the immediate costs of restoring your land. It's the money Karen should have used for actual community maintenance. We're considering it our first real investment in being a good neighbor." It was a powerful gesture. It was an acknowledgement of shared responsibility and a genuine offer of peace. I accepted it, not just as payment, but as the foundation of a new relationship. The $225,000 from Karen arrived a few months later, transferred from an escrow account after the sale of her house. It was a hollow, anticlimactic event. The money was never the point. It was a tool, a means to an end. The real victory was in the justice served and the community healed. I used the funds from the HOA to hire a local crew to begin the painstaking work of restoring the 3 acres Karen had destroyed. They carefully tilled the compacted soil, amended it with rich compost, and prepared it for planting. The money from Karen's judgment went into a trust for the farm's future, ensuring its legacy would continue long after I was gone. I also invested a portion of it in a legal defense fund for small farmers in our state, a resource for others who might find themselves bullied by powerful interests. The new HOA board, true to their word, worked with me on the issue of the walking trail. They didn't abandon the idea, but they approached it with respect. I walked the property line with Tom and David, and we identified a beautiful, natural path that ran along the edge of my woods, well inside their property, that would connect their common areas without ever touching my fields. They hired Frank, my surveyor, to officially mark it. As a final gesture of goodwill, I used my tractor and a box blade to help them clear and level the new trail. It was hard work under the hot sun, but it felt right. It was an act of building, not destroying. A year later, as I stood on my porch, the ugly scar in my field was gone. In its place, a healthy, vibrant stand of bloody butcher corn grew tall, its tassels catching the evening breeze. The deep red kernels were just beginning to show, a promise of a bountiful harvest. In the distance, I could see a family from Whispering Pines walking along the new, sanctioned trail, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. They paused at the edge of the woods and looked out over my field, not as an unsightly nuisance, but as a part of the landscape, a piece of shared history. They waved and I waved back. The war was long over, the victory won not through brute force, but through patience, documentation, and the quiet, unyielding power of a community united against injustice. Karen Miller had tried to bulldoze her way through my life. In the end, all she had managed to do was bulldoze her own. I had my land, my legacy, and now a peace I had fought for and won, and that was a harvest richer than any crop I could ever grow.